Dorie Clark has been named one of the top 50 business thinkers in the world by Thinkers 50. She is a keynote speaker and teaches executive education at Duke University. She is also the Wall Street Journal bestselling author of The Long Game, Entrepreneurial You, Reinventing You, and Standout, which was named the number one leadership book of the year by Inc. magazine. A former presidential campaign spokeswoman, she writes frequently for the Harvard Business Review, and you can learn more at dorieclark.com. Dorie, welcome to Hustle and Grace.
Hey, Hilary, I'm glad to be here.
I'm so excited to have you here. I have to say, I have been like a fan reader. I've dug Dorie Clark content for a long time, but in researching you for this interview, I just learned that you were like a bit of a child genius. You went to college at 14. What?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. No, I just like to think I was highly motivated because I grew up in a little small town I wanted to get out of. So I feel like if given similar situations, people often come up with strategies. I just read Arnold Schwarzenegger's memoir, and I think he sort of felt about his little mountain town in Austria the way that I did, which is, all right, how do we strategize here? I did not, in fact, choose bodybuilding as my vehicle, but I respect his choice.
Well, you matched him in motivation. That's incredible. So, I mean, just before we even dive into like where you are today, talk to me about what that experience was like being like on a college campus, when you're 14, 15, 16 years old. What was that experience like?
Well, the good news for me was, so I was doing this at Mary Baldwin College, now Mary Baldwin University, which is in Stanton, Virginia. And so they have a program, which they still have to this day, which enables a kind of cohort of people to go to college early. So it was not like it was like just me and then a bunch of, older people.
I was picturing Doogie Howser, like you're in the room with people twice your age. I don't know.
Yeah, not quite that bad. No, there were like 50-ish people maybe who were also my age. So we had a cohort of people, and it was actually fantastic for me. It was fantastic because it was the first time en masse. I had sort of had, occasional one-offs before, but it was the first time en masse that I really found a group of friends that I loved, that I thought were so interesting and so cool. And, just they were my age and they were interested in similar things. And I relished that. That was great. I mean, of course, that all, I had a girlfriend and then we broke up and then all the friends went with her. So then it sucked. But for a while, it was great. And I gave a real thumbs up. And my professors at Mary Baldwin were, super inspiring. They were really, really dedicated, smart teachers. This was not a university that was obsessed with people doing research. These were teaching professors. And so they loved it. Of course, that like you have this group of students, even if they're 14, like if you're a professor, you really dig it when the students are like, no, tell me more. And so we had a great relationship.
Yeah, I'm sure they loved that energy. And I'm curious, I have to say, from my perspective, I have two little girls, age 1 and 3. What do you think your parents got right? Like, not that I necessarily am eager to like ship them off to college in 10 years, but I have to know, like, from a parenting perspective, like, what do you think they sort of got right in you?
Oh, well, there's a lot of presuppositions that they did, but thank you for them. Well, I mean, I'm very close to my mom, and we're still homies. I still talk to her all the time, and I think probably my favorite thing about my mom is that she really was very good. I think just about everybody in at least American child rearing circles pays lip service to the, I just want my child to be happy. Like that's the sort of, thing you're supposed to say. But really it's like, and I want them to be a doctor, and I want them to have a doctorate, and I want them to make a lot of money, and I want them to marry the exact right person who comes from an Ivy League school. Oh, and I want them to be happy.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's sort of these competing scripts, but my mom was just very good at kind of like walking the talk. And as it turns out, I mean, I was extremely self-motivated, like all the things that I did, it was not in any way coming from pressure from my parents or anything like that. Like, I actually really believe it, that if I was just interested in like, I don't know, basket weaving, she probably would have been into it. I mean, she had her own agenda about she really wanted me to be well-rounded. Like, I think,
Sure, sure,
she was
sure.
very into the, like, I want to give you the things that I didn't have. So she wanted to expose me to important things like ballet, which I'm like, like, don't, but she did. But she also, in addition to making me do ballet, if ever I expressed an interest in something that I wanted to do, she was like all in. She's like, oh, great. You can have lessons in that. You can go to camp for that. And so there was a lot of support for just the things that I wanted to try and explore. So that was great. And, even when it would kind of go against prevailing norms, I was, a lot of people, like, especially around like gender related play and whatever, people, very got their sort of mindset. But I mean, my mom, I can't even tell you. Well, I will tell you, I had 76 GI Joes. I love GI Joe. And, that was all good. That was all good. So, and I appreciate it because they were super fun.
That's awesome. I have, followed your writing for a long time, and you said something a while ago. I was, I think 24, and I wanted to be a theater actor, but I also, something that my parents and teachers had always told me was I had this knack for writing that was like not normal, I guess. Like, to me, I didn't understand why it wasn't just easy for everybody, I guess. And one thing that you wrote at one point is, if three people call you a horse, buy a saddle. And it stuck with me, and I couldn't ever really get away from that. I had to embrace what people were telling me that I naturally had a knack for. So could you share a little bit about like how you had that aha moment? How, can you just unpack sort of what that means?
I can, absolutely. And the best aha moments are the ones that you don't even have to have yourself. And so the way that I had this, I mean, my original training was, I was a journalist, not for very long. I was a journalist for a year. I would have been a journalist for longer, but then I got laid off and I couldn't find another journalism job. But, frankly, even a year of being a journalist actually trains you really well, because I mean, to spend a year of your life just like writing under deadline again and again and again and again is a fantastic form of reps. And writing is like the most transferable skill you can possibly have in business.
100%.
So anyway, when I started writing books, my kind of go-to methodology, people have different ways of doing this. Some people are like big researchers and whatever, they go to the library and read all the books. But my go-to methodology coming out of journalism was basically, oh, well, I'll talk to people, I'll ask people. And so for all of my books, I've just really started with a ton of interviews with smart people that I thought would have something interesting to say or something to contribute. And so what you're referring to, the great quote, which I love, if three people tell you you're a horse, buy a saddle, is actually something that I picked up from a colleague of mine named Judy Robinette, who is a angel investor. She's also an author. She wrote a great book about networking. And she apparently she didn't even invent it. She told me, she says, well, it's a Hungarian proverb. And so anyway, I ended up going to
Sorry
Hungary.
to the Hungarians that I misattributed that.
Oh, well, that's okay, because yeah, I go to Hungary and I'm like, oh, well, the famous proverb, if three people tell you and they're like, what? That's not a Hungarian proverb. They're like, nah. So we have no idea. We have no idea. So for lack of a better reason, we will attribute it to Judy Robinette until we learn otherwise. But what's really fantastic about it is, I think it points to something, which is that so often the conversation around personal branding, I mean, yes, it is 100% true. We should be aware of our personal brands. We should take effort to shape that, because, it is important what our reputation is. That is a legitimately important thing. But it doesn't, shaping your personal brand isn't the starting point. It's the second point, because the first thing is understanding, oh, you already have a brand. People already think something. And so
Right.
you can't ignore that fact. Like, there's something out there, and it behooves us to understand what it is so that we then can be smart about taking steps. If we don't like it, okay, fine. Well, we can do things, we can shape it, but we at least need to understand, oh, if all these people are saying that I am a horse, maybe I really need to do some important PR work to convince them I'm not a horse, or maybe they know something I don't, which is perhaps equally possible.
Absolutely. I guess it starts with that awareness. Okay, let me continue to quote you to yourself. Things that have impacted me over the years. Something else that you said, and this is going to be more of like like a summary. I don't have the direct quote, but it was such a relief to me when I heard you say, there are seasons when I'm writing and I'm making stuff and I'm head down and I don't worry about promoting it. And I don't worry about being in the public eye. And I don't worry about being on and pushing, post or publish or whatever. And then there are times when it's go time and it's time to be out there and it's time to be promoting the thing. And I think for someone who feels like the long game goal is to build a community, to build a platform or whatever, you feel like you have to always be on. And that can just lead to burnout and it can be utterly exhausting. So you said something to that effect at one point, but I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that, about how for the long game, your career is in waves. So could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And good job quoting me to me. I appreciate that. So yes, this is exactly right. And in the long game, here we go, prop alert, in the long game,
Hey.
I have a section where I talk about thinking in waves, where I really address this in more depth. But I think my thinking about this years ago, and I've of course expounded on it a lot since then, but the first time that I really sort of thought about it, speaking of like hearing a sort of inspiring quote, was, probably 15 years ago. I was at a conference and I heard Susie Welch speak, the wife of the late Jack Welch, the former CEO of General Electric. And I think the two of them had just written a book about careers or whatever. And she had an interesting statement, which, somebody had asked about talk about the, can women have it all sort of, question, which, whatever periodically comes up. And I thought her perspective was really good. She said, well, it's absolutely true. You can have it all, but not at the same time. And I thought, that seems very sensible, right? I mean, it's not this like binary, like you either have it all or you've got nothing. I mean, right. Like, no, that doesn't make sense. What makes a heck of a lot more sense is that, anything good takes a lot of energy. And there's only so much energy in the world. And so what is it that you are choosing to focus on at a given time so that you can make progress? And it's also true that there are more and less effective strategies. Like a lot of people, frankly, I think what holds them back in some ways is that they decide, oh, well, I am going to have it all. I'm going to focus on everything. But then they just do this crap job of it. And they they do everything, yes, but they don't do it very well. And so they just sort of progress a little bit incrementally, trying to eke it out. Whereas, the honest truth is, like, if you really want to have a lot of business success, you kind of have to work a lot. Like, I wish that weren't true, but you sort of do. And it's also equally true that there are times in your life when, and maybe it's whatever, like during COVID and you've got sick people to care for, or you've got, homeschooling that you suddenly have to do. Like, that's not the time that you have a lot of bandwidth. And that's like literally just reality. Like, we need to sort of embrace what is correct, what is true, and be like, okay, I'm going to deal with the situation on the ground. I would never expect someone or like berate someone for like, why aren't you making more progress when you need to simultaneously do 36 hours worth of work in 24 hours? Like, it just doesn't compute. So I think for me, as I think about my philosophy of thinking in waves, it's really, being kind to ourselves and understanding like, okay, the most important thing is, like, a mistake that people make, I think, is they get used to doing one thing that they either like or they're good at or whatever. And they just keep doing that. And then they get mad at the world because it's like, well, I keep working so hard and why am I not being successful? Blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, you can't be successful just doing one thing. You do need to do all of the things. All the things need to be done eventually, but it is equally true. You don't have to do them at the same time. You just kind of need a plan. Like, all right, for a year, I'm going to focus on this. And then next year, okay, I'll focus on this other thing. And if you can do that, you actually can make pretty good progress over time.
Yeah. And that is like a perfect segue into talking about, like, in more of a macro way, the long game, your new book. So what is the long game? Are we talking about like now to 10 years from now, the rest of our career? Like, what are we talking about? And what is really your goal with this book? What do you really want to communicate with it?
So your question is a good one, and I get asked quite a bit sometimes, like, well, okay, define long-term thinking. And the truth is, of course, it's a little bit of a fool's errand to say, oh, well, short term is up to 9 years, and then long term is 10 years plus. Like,
Right.
not exactly, right? Life is a little more gray than that. Um, Broadly speaking, I mean, of course, right? We think 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, that's long term, as at least as regards an individual human lifespan. But I also believe that long-term thinking is a framework. It's kind of a lens that we put on things. And so long-term thinking can be a very useful way of enabling you to think about what you want to do literally today or literally tomorrow. It's a question of things like, do you have an extra hour? Do you go to the gym? I mean, going to the gym in the short term, like, why would you do that? It's like kind of
Right.
painful. It's kind of boring. Like, wouldn't it be more fun to like hang out with a friend or like have a martini? I mean, probably, and I mean, if you were, if like literally you knew you were dying tomorrow, maybe that's exactly the choice you were making. But I mean, for most of us, we hope, we're sort of planning for this, like, oh gosh, well, it actually would be good to be in good shape when you're 80. It would be, a good thing to lay the groundwork of healthy habits. And so maybe I actually should spend that hour on going to the gym. And so I think, the way that I define it, my sort of shortcut for, how do you do short-term thinking is, short-term versus long-term thinking is long-term thinking is asking yourself the question, what can I do today that will make tomorrow better and easier? And
Mm.
sort of the corollary to that is, what is it that I can do today that will make the Dorie of 2025, the Dorie of 2030, the Dorie of 2060 be like, hey, good job. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Like that's the
Yes.
situation I'd like.
I have a friend who says, do something today that your future self will thank you for.
That's
That's
right.
ding,
Yes.
ding, ding. That's awesome. Okay. And I have to ask you, one of your long-term goals is it feels like a bit of a pivot. It's to have a Broadway show, right? To write a Broadway show. Please,
Yes.
I love that because I'm a theater person, but you wouldn't know it in like my day-to-day work for sure. But I love it and I love Broadway and I just watched the Tonys. I mean, it's definitely like my thing. So when I read that you too fall into that camp in some way, shape, or form, I was A, surprised. And then B, like, not only do you like go see shows when you're in New York, you're like writing one. So can you talk a little bit about like how you got that idea and what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I, continue to be working on it regularly. I mean, on the plane up to New York yesterday, I was literally doing scripting rewrites for my show that I'm working on, which is going to have a semi-staged reading in Dallas
Hey,
in August. So I'm very
congrats.
excited about that. So putting some, finishing touches on it to try to make it as awesome as it can be. But the way that I came to it, I mean, so a lot of times people ask about, like, well, how can I pick the right goals? How can I find, the right things to focus on? And again, I think that this is a situation where sometimes we overthink things, or sometimes we're putting too much pressure on ourselves. I mean, you know, like, I don't know, I can tell you the wrong goals. I mean, the wrong goals would be like, whatever, something that is like totally self-destructive, but like the right goal can mean a lot of things. I mean, writing a show that ends up on Broadway, I think if you're really trying super hard to be like, what is the right goal? You might not pick that because it might seem random, or it might seem like, well, you don't know anything about that. Why would you pick that? But like, I don't care. I want it to be my goal, So I think, you gotta have some fun in life, right? You gotta, there's a topic that I talk about in the long game called optimize for interesting. And I think we need to pick things that are interesting for us, which often can be a stretch, or often can be something that, maybe other people don't get. But the way that I came to that goal was actually going, I mean, it was not really at all a logical process. I went to a show with a friend in January of 2016, and I was like, I hadn't even been to a show in like a very long time. And I was very inspired by it. And I woke up the next morning and I was like, I need to write a show. And I didn't know how. I had literally no idea how. I was like Googling how to write a musical. And, since then, of course, I have learned a lot. I've learned a lot more about how to do it. But it started as just a very sort of nascent impulse that I ran with, and then got a lot more expertise.
I love that. And we also have to talk about this impressive feat that you've done, which is committed to the 4-day work week. I love it. I've seen you like post like, this is my Friday. I'm out and about living my life. I don't know. Did you decide to do a 4-day work week during the pandemic, or how did you get to that point? Was that also like a long-term goal of yours? And how are you able to like set that boundary?
Yeah. It's, so the first thing I'll say too is, again, in the spirit of like, being nicer to ourselves there, I have not kept to it 100% religiously over the past 2-ish years. I started doing it in September 2020. During my book launch, for instance, I just voluntarily, sort of set that aside. And I'm like, you know what? I really need 5 days. and I felt okay about that because, that's not slippage. That is a conscious choice of like, yes, this is actually a really important thing that I need to do. And so for this period of time, I am going to be just going full out as I need to in order to make a book launch successful. But yeah, I really, what that stemmed from, I mean, of course, probably like everybody, I think everybody in sort of in inchoate way is like, yes, a 4-day work week sounds great. But in terms of actually being prompted to take action, I did start it during the pandemic because I spent the summer, like the spring and summer of the pandemic, just working myself into a frenzy, basically, because I thought, perhaps not unreasonably, that instead of what actually bizarrely happened, which is the economy like took off, I thought that the economy would collapse. And I was like, oh my God, I am not going to earn any money this year. Like the world economy is going to be frozen. There's going to be no money to be had. And so I was just like letting it ride. I'm like, pretty much any assignment I could take, I'm like, great, I'll do that. I'll do that. Because I just really, I felt like, my metaphor in my head was like an Eskimo storing fish for the winter. I'm just like, great, let's have all the fish so that I have something to eat during the winter. And it was such a frenzy that at a certain point, by the time September rolled around and we're like 6 months into the pandemic, I'm like, okay, gosh, I guess the economy isn't collapsing. Well, that's weird. But by then I had stockpiled a lot of money and I was like super burned out. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to actually do myself a favor and I'm going to like turn the dial down a notch and take Fridays off.
Love it. Love it. Good for you. Yeah. That awareness. And I cannot blame you at all for thinking like I should work while I've got the chance, because who knew what was going to happen?
Yeah. What was it like for you, Hilary, in the early days of the pandemic? Did you do something similar, or what was your response?
Well, I had a 17-month-old baby. We went from living right outside of DC in our townhouse to down south with my parents, more space for baby to run around.
Yes.
And I did work a lot. It was interesting because I had one client that was like, we got to cut your contract a lot. And I panicked. And then all of these other clients were popping up, especially like in the nonprofit space. I have this hypothesis that like people felt so like so sort of helpless. They're like, I don't know what to do to help. I'm just going to give money to nonprofits. And so then nonprofits were like inundated. And so they needed help with marketing, with writing and strategy and that kind of thing. So yeah, so I was pretty busy, and I should say it was also good for my podcast because all of a sudden like book tours were canceled. I got, Dan Pink came on the podcast within like, I don't know, 5 days notice. He was like, sure. Like, what else am I doing? I didn't even have to like get on his calendar way in advance. So, selfishly there were some perks for me, but before we go, I would love to hear you just share whatever pops to your head, like one favorite practical tip from the long game.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate it. So when it comes to the long game, there's a lot that we cover because there's a lot of aspects of becoming a long-term thinker. But one of my favorites, just in terms of like a rule of thumb that I think people can adopt, is I have a section in the book where I talk about networking and about relationships, because obviously that's really important when it comes to your long-term future, right? Is the people you know, the people you interact with, they're the folks who can open the doors to opportunity, who even, sort of show you or kind of role model by osmosis what is possible for you. And so one of the things that I discovered in really looking into this and researching it, obviously we know there's a lot of people that really don't like networking, they sort of actively diss it and they eschew it, mostly because they feel like, oh, it's either me using people and I don't want to do that, or it's them trying to use me. It's this very like Machiavellian worldview. And so I have a kind of rule of thumb that I use, which is no asks for a year. And I feel like if everybody adopted this, that this would make the world a better place. So I'm trying to get it out there, which is basically, you want to send the signal to the people that you're connecting with that you are not a user. And also, I think it's really important, if you are in fact getting to know someone who is, powerful or interesting or does have the ability to have influence. I mean, obviously you want to be that person's friend because they seem cool and together and whatever, but there's probably a lot of people disproportionately who kind of want something from that person. And so it's also really, really important, I think, for our own well-being to close off that possibility so that we don't even subconsciously go there, like just not a thing, not a possibility. And so if we adopt a rule where there is no asks for a year, at least a year, in terms of getting to know somebody, and specifically what I mean by that, no politically sensitive asks, right? It's not like, oh, Hilary, I like your glasses, what brand are they? Like that's fine. But if it's, it's things like, oh, can you introduce me to your famous friend? Oh, could you connect me to your editor? Whatever the thing is that like the users would want, we want to stay the heck away from that. But if we can do that, it really enables us to build legitimate relationships, legitimate friendships, after which point, I mean, if you've been friends legitimately with somebody for a year, they're going to want to help you. You're going to want to help them. And it no longer becomes a weird, like tit for tat kind of user thing. You're just friends and it can be normal. But I think that's, for me, one of the most useful sort of heuristics that we can embrace.
Absolutely. You're just friends. Let it be normal. I love that. All right, Dorie, I mentioned at the beginning that people can find you at dorieclark.com. Are you on the socials anywhere you want to share?
I do have all the social media things. So yeah, people can definitely connect with me on different social channels. I do a lot on LinkedIn. Folks can go to I have a short link. It's dorieclark.com/LI. And you can follow me on LinkedIn or subscribe to my LinkedIn newsletter. But probably the main thing that I would mention to them, Hilary, is for folks who are interested in long-term thinking, strategic thinking, which we've been talking about, if you want to get a free strategic thinking self-assessment that I created, just go to dorieclark.com/the-long-game, and folks can download the self-assessment for free.
Awesome. Right on. Thank you so much, Dorie.
Thank you. So good talking to you.
You too.